You recognize a voice when it finally calls you back, even if it sounds like a dinosaur, even if it comes from a wild heart. And what happened next? No one could have predicted. The fog rolled in heavier than usual that morning, coiling low along the cliffs of Northern California, smothering the sound of the waves. Elliot Marks was halfway through his walk, coffee growing cold in his hand, when he heard something, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the screech of a hawk, or the howl of a coyote, or even the scream of a mountain lion. No, this sound was older somehow. It rose up from the trees like a beast exhaling after thousands of years asleep. It cracked through the stillness like a voice out of time, a roar with no name. He froze, and then he saw it, a bobcat. Not huge, not fearsome, just there. Dust-colored fur, eyes fixed on him, calm like it had been waiting. And then, that sound again. Something between a trumpet and a growl, like a dinosaur had borrowed a throat and decided to sing. That should have been the end of it. A strange encounter, a story to laugh about over coffee. But it wasn't, because the next day, the bobcat came back, and the day after that. And before Elliot knew it, the wild had come to his doorstep, not just with claws and instinct, but with something that sounded like joy. People would later ask him, "Why didn't you run? Weren't you afraid? What kind of animal sounds like that?" But the truth was, when you've lived long enough with silence, real silence, the kind that settles in after grief, you recognize a voice when it finally calls you back. If you've ever felt like the world stopped hearing your voice, maybe this story reminded you. Even in the wildest corners of silence, something can still answer back. If you believe that bond was more than chance, that some connections echo louder than reason, then don't just scroll past. Subscribe to hear the next wild voice calling through the fog. You never know which one might speak to you. The fog came early to the cliffs that morning. It pressed in from the Pacific like a sleeping beast, thick and silver and slow-moving, blanketing the pines and swallowing the sound of the tide below. From his front porch, Elliot Marks could barely make out the edge of the trail that curved down into the bluff. Everything beyond was a muted silhouette, but he liked it this way. There were no horns out here, no phones ringing, no neighbor's dog barking through chain-link fences, just the hush of fog rolling in over cypress and salt grass, and the rhythmic sigh of the ocean beyond. Elliot, now 62, had been retired for 3 years. After decades of marine biology work, expedition research, and a teaching stint up north, he'd left it all behind, following Mara's illness. Their dream had always been to retire near the coast, just the two of them, a weathered cabin and the sea. He kept the dream, alone. His mornings had become rituals of solitude. Pour the coffee, wrap the flannel tight, walk the bluff trail with an old recorder in hand, just in case the sea had something new to say. That's what he was doing when he heard it. At first, it came as a shudder in his chest more than a sound, like something heavy falling deep underground. Then it rose, slowly, eerily, from the trees to his left, a sound he couldn't place. It wasn't sharp like a coyote's bark or screeching like a hawk's call. It wasn't even mournful like the long, rising wail of a mountain lion. No, this was deeper, raw. It sounded like a trumpet that had been buried for centuries, unearthed and blown through by a ghost. Elliot stopped walking. The coffee sloshed in his mug. His eyes scanned the tree line, every sense alert now. He reached instinctively for the recorder on his shoulder strap and pressed the red button. Another call rang out, louder this time. It cracked through the fog like a split in the sky. Then silence. Elliot whispered to himself. That wasn't normal. He crouched low by the trail's edge and waited. After about 30 seconds, the brush just ahead rustled. Carefully, slowly, something moved through the fog. Low to the ground, silent. And then, there it was. A bobcat. Not a particularly large one, but unmistakably wild. Short tail, tufted ears, mottled coat blending with the bark and shadows. Its body moved like liquid muscle, agile and controlled. But what struck Elliot most was not the animal's size or movement. It was how it looked at him. Not with fear, not with aggression, with something else. Familiarity, maybe, or curiosity. The bobcat didn't run. It stepped forward, slow and deliberate, placing each paw like it knew the trail better than he did. The distance between them closed by a few feet, then paused. Elliot held his breath, and then, again, that sound. Not from the trees this time, from the catalogue. It came from deep in the creature's throat, more rumble than growl, rising into something unplaceable. A roar? A bellow? A call? It felt ancient. It echoed in Elliot's ribs like the memory of thunder. The bobcat blinked, stared, and then, as silently as it had appeared, it turned and vanished into the fog. Elliot didn't move for a full minute. His heart was pounding, not out of fear, but awe. That noise, that impossible, bone-deep noise. It didn't belong to this coast or any animal he knew. And yet here it was, wrapped in fur, walking a trail most tourists didn't even know existed. He stopped the recording and played it back. The sound came through, faint, distorted, but real. Enough to give him chills. He didn't tell anyone that day. What could he say? I met a bobcat who sounds like a dinosaur. Instead, he spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing animal call databases, logging the encounter in an old field journal, and replaying the audio over and over. No matches, no precedents. But the next morning, just as the mist began to lift from the valley, Elliot returned to the trail. This time, he brought a small tin of sardines. He left them on a flat stone near where the bobcat had appeared. Not a trap, just an offering. He didn't know what he expected. A part of him hoped he'd imagined the whole thing, that the sound had been the wind, that maybe grief, long buried, was shaping strange stories again. But the next day, the sardines were gone, and on the stone, neatly placed as if by design, was a single pine cone. Elliot stared at it for a long time, then laughed aloud. Not because it made sense, because it didn't. The pine cone wasn't a coincidence. Elliot knew enough about wildlife behavior to say that with near certainty, bobcats didn't collect souvenirs. They didn't rearrange objects. They didn't leave offerings. And yet, the cone sat precisely where the tin had been, clean, dry, like it had been set down gently rather than dropped. Not rolled, not blown by wind. Placed. He didn't tell Carla, not yet. She'd ask too many questions, reasonable ones, the kind that didn't mix well with the half-holy silence he felt out there. Instead, the next day, Elliot left out a soft towel, one of Mara's old ones, worn thin but still clean. He folded it on the stone like it mattered. This time, he waited in the trees, sat cross-legged on a log 50 feet back, wrapped in pine scent and fog. It was nearly dusk when the bobcat returned. Silent as breath, it stepped into view, alert but unhurried. Its fur was still matted in places, its body lean and dusted with burrs, but it moved like something unbothered by suffering. It approached the towel, sniffed once, then lowered itself down and, without a sound, curled up atop it. Not to eat, not to paw or tear, just to rest. Like it understood comfort. Elliot didn't move, didn't breathe. He watched the bobcat's side rise and fall, slow and steady. And then, it made the sound again. Not as loud as before. Not the full-bodied roar that shattered air. This one was gentler, drawn out, like the sound had mellowed to meet the moment. Still low and resonant, still strange, but quieter. It sounded, Elliot thought, like longing. He didn't try to approach. He knew better. Wild was wild. But something had shifted. The next morning, he left the towel on the porch. By evening, the bobcat was there. Elliot stood at the door and stared at the creature lying across the towel, front paws crossed like a sphinx. It didn't flinch when he stepped closer. Its golden eyes followed him, but without alarm. And again, just once, it made the sound, that same deep, impossible note. By now, Elliot had saved multiple recordings, cross-checked with every wildlife call database he had access to. Nothing matched. Not feline, not canine, not avian. Carla had emailed some audio specialists she knew. 2 replied, saying the frequency range was unusual for any known terrestrial mammal. One asked if it had been manipulated digitally. Elliot didn't respond. He started calling the bobcat Echo. It wasn't official. He never said it out loud. But the name took root in his mind. Echo. For the sound, yes, but also for the way the animal seemed to return each time, like a call from the forest that always came back to him. After 2 weeks, Echo started sleeping on the porch more often than not, sometimes curled up in the sunroom. Once, during a thunderstorm, Elliot woke in the middle of the night and found the bobcat huddled beneath the kitchen table, wet, trembling, wide-eyed. He didn't speak. He just grabbed an old wool blanket and laid it down. Echo stepped onto it without hesitation. The house, which had echoed too long with emptiness, now had something moving inside it. Something breathing, warm, alive, and loud. Because some nights, out of nowhere, Echo would unleash that sound. Not a growl, not a hiss, that roar. But it wasn't angry. It was something else. Joy? Mourning? Some primal emotion that didn't have a proper English name? It sent a shiver up Elliot's spine every time. But it never made him afraid. Quite the opposite. It made him feel seen. One night, just before the high full moon, Elliot was chopping firewood when Carla arrived unannounced. She parked her dusty Subaru in the gravel and stepped out with her usual smirk and a thermos in hand. "Still stalking the bobcat with the ghost trumpet in its throat?" she teased. Elliot gave a half smile. "You have to hear it for yourself." They didn't have to wait long. Just after nightfall, as the clouds parted and the moon bathed the pines in silver, Echo appeared at the edge of the trail, calm, composed. He walked up the porch steps like he lived there. Carla's smile vanished. Echo turned to the dark woods, ears twitching, and let it out. That sound. Even after hearing the recording, even knowing what to expect, Carla gasped and dropped her thermos. The sound rolled over them, ancient and physical, like the air itself had changed density. Birds scattered from the trees. Pine needles rained down like snow. "That's not a bobcat," she whispered. Elliot just looked at her. "I know." Echo padded into the house, paused by the fire and yawned. The yawning made no noise, but even it felt majestic somehow. Carla sat down slowly. "You're going to have to report this eventually." Elliot didn't answer, because he already knew he wouldn't. Some animals, he thought, are born to be studied. Others are born to be stories. And Echo was something else, entirely. He wasn't here to be solved. He was here to be heard. The silence came without warning. After weeks of near-daily visits, of Echo pacing the porch at dawn or curling up by the fire just before dusk, of that ancient roar echoing off the cliffside, he simply stopped showing up. Elliot waited the first day without worry. Wild was wild after all. Maybe Echo had wandered deeper into the hills. Maybe the call of something unseen had pulled him away. But by the second day, the coffee tasted like ash. By the third, the silence in the house wasn't peace anymore. It was absence. He walked the trails, left out food, whistled once, even though he knew it was foolish. And when the wind came in from the coast, rattling the window panes, he found himself pausing, listening for that sound, the one that wasn't supposed to exist. Nothing came. No paw prints near the porch, no pine cone left behind, just mist and quiet and worry. It wasn't until the fifth day that he found the blood, a faint smear of it on a low branch just off the southern trail. Fresh. Not much, but enough to spike something deep in Elliot's chest. He followed it, slow, deliberate, the way a younger version of himself might have stalked injured seals during rescue work. Each sign was faint. A bit of flattened grass, a smear along a bark ridge, a claw scrape on a rock. The trail zigzagged higher toward the rocky bluff behind the cove. Then, between two fallen logs, under the thick arms of an old Monterey pine, he saw him. Echo, curled up, limpio. Alive, but barely. His fur was matted with dried blood near the haunch. A wound, deep, but not fatal, ran along his back leg. His breathing was shallow, his eyes unfocused. Elliot didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees and pulled off his coat, whispering his name over and over. Echo, Echo, I've got you. Stay with me. The bobcat didn't growl, didn't protest, just blinked once, slowly, and exhaled a soft, guttural rumble. Not the roar, not even close. It was quieter than ever before. Elliot lifted him into his coat like a newborn and made the long walk back, one cautious step at a time. Back at the cabin, he cleaned the wound, boiled water, mixed salt with antiseptic. He worked with the calm panic of someone who'd done this before, not with bobcats, but with life, with grief, with loss. Echo didn't resist the care. He lay still on the blanket near the fire, breathing shallow but steady. The wound would scar, but it wasn't mortal. What worried Elliot more was the silence. For 3 days, Echo didn't make a sound, not a hiss, not a purr, not that impossible, beautiful roar that had made the cliffs feel haunted by history. And something inside Elliot began to ache. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to rely on that voice, how much it had filled the empty spaces of the house, of his heart. It was as if, without that sound, the forest itself had stopped breathing. He kept vigil through the nights, dosing in the armchair, tending the fire. Echo healed slowly, eating, sleeping, standing on shaky legs by the end of the week. But still no sound. Elliot recorded anyway, just in case. Then, on the 9th day, just before sunrise, he woke to the sound of claws padding across the hardwood. Echo was standing by the open porch door. The breeze lifted his fur. Elliot reached for the recorder, but he didn't need it, because at that moment, without looking back, Echo tilted his head to the sky and let loose a sound that shook the entire valley. It was raw, louder than ever, not broken, reborn. And Elliot, still sitting in his old flannel, laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his face. Echo had come back. So had the voice, and neither of them would be silent again. The sound carried farther than it ever had before. It rolled through the pines and over the cliffs, startled a flock of gulls off the shoreline, and sent a distant hiker stumbling as he tried to explain to his girlfriend that, no, that was not a mountain lion. Elliot stood on the porch, barefoot on cold wood, hand still resting on the recorder he hadn't pressed. He didn't need to. That moment, raw, thunderous, alive, was burned into his memory in perfect detail. Echo was different now, stronger, quieter in his body, but louder in his voice. Every time he opened his mouth and let that sound fly, it was as if the past and present collapsed into one, and the earth remembered something it had long buried. And now others were beginning to notice. First, it was Carla. She returned to the cabin 3 days after the roar, holding a USB drive with a trembling hand. "You've started something," she said. On the drive were 6 emails, wildlife analysts, sound archivists, a bioacoustics researcher from Oregon who had somehow heard the sample and written back in all caps, "What am I listening to?" But Elliot wasn't looking to publish. Not yet. Echo had become more than a specimen. He was something that had chosen to stay, not because of enclosure or handouts, but because of something quieter. Something like understanding. Carla seemed to sense it. She stayed longer than usual that afternoon, sitting on the back steps with her mug of black tea and watching Echo as he dozed near the old oak. "I've worked with wolves, cats, even a fox that mimicked ringtones," she said. "But this feels ancestral. Like he's remembering something from before we had names for things." Elliot nodded. "He doesn't sound wild anymore. He sounds wise." That evening, something shifted. As twilight crept across the trees and turned the sky soft orange, Echo rose to his feet and padded down the trail behind the cabin, not wandering, walking with intent. Elliot followed. They moved slowly, deeper than they'd ever gone together. Past the alder grove, past the fern-ringed stream where Mara used to pick wildflowers, up a slope that opened to a mossy ridge overlooking the sea. Echo stopped it. He stood there for a moment, ears twitching in the wind, eyes fixed on something only he could see. Then, once more, he roared. But this time it wasn't for Elliot. It was for the land. The sound was deeper now, more refined, as if something in him had healed fully, physically, spiritually. The valley echoed back with gull cries, then went still. Elliot stood a few paces behind, silent. He didn't want to intrude. He just watched as Echo sat down, back straight, tail curled at his side, eyes shining gold in the dying light. There, in that moment, Elliot understood something he hadn't been able to name until now. Echo wasn't staying because he needed help. He was staying because he had found someone who listened. The world was full of noise. Cars, sirens, headlines, static. But Echo had found a voice louder than all of it. And Elliot had chosen not to silence it, not to study it, not to sell it. He had simply heard it. And that, somehow, had changed everything. Time moved differently after that night on the ridge. The sound no longer shocked Elliot. It belonged now, like wind through trees or waves on rock. Natural, but never ordinary. The valley had grown used to it too. The birds didn't scatter like before. The deer didn't bolt at the sound. It had woven itself into the rhythm of the land. And Echo, he changed too. He began ranging farther in the daylight, disappearing into the cypress groves for hours, sometimes a full day. But he always returned before dusk, slipping into the golden light as if drawn by an invisible tether. Elliot stopped recording, not because the sound had lost its magic, but because he no longer needed to prove it was real. Echo had become a fact in his life, not a phenomenon. A presence, a companion. He built a gate in the back fence, not to contain Echo, but to honor his freedom. And yet, night after night, the Bobcat chose to come home. Some days, Echo would lounge in the sunroom, tail flicking against the old rug. Other days, he'd perch on the porch railing like a sentinel, and occasionally, without any prompting, he would roar, low and long, a sound that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human. Elliot would smile from the window every time. He'd stopped trying to explain it. When hikers asked about the noise, he'd shrug and say, "Old trees make strange sounds." When researchers emailed asking for updates, he let the messages sit unanswered. Some stories weren't meant for headlines. Some were meant to be lived quietly in wild places with no names attached. That summer, on the anniversary of Mara's passing, Elliot stood by her favorite spot, the lavender bushes near the sea cliff, and left a single shell, a sand dollar she'd found on their first visit to this very coast. He didn't say anything, just stood in the silence, until Echo appeared at his side. He didn't walk up like he usually did. He arrived already standing still, already there, like he'd always been part of the memory. And then he let out one long, thunderous call, a roar that shook the petals from the lavender and sent them swirling into the wind. Elliot didn't cry. Not that day. He just placed his hand gently on the rough stone wall and whispered, "Thank you." That night, Echo didn't come inside. He lay on the ridge instead, staring out at the sea. And when Elliot looked up from the porch, he saw the silhouette of the bobcat against the full moon, still and proud. Eventually, the day came when Echo didn't return. Not that week, not the next. Elliot searched, but only once. Something in him knew better than to go too far. Wild hearts sometimes needed to go, and the greatest kindness was letting them. But months later, deep into fall, he was out planting new lavender starts when he heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. That roar, not a recording, not memory, real. Elliot smiled, knelt in the dirt, and kept digging, because he didn't need to see Echo anymore to know he was still there. The valley remembered him. The wind carried him. And somewhere in the cliffs, his voice still lived. He had roared his truth into the world, and it had echoed back. Some voices are too wild to cage, and some echoes never fade.